Hi, everybody. Thank you so very much for joining us today. My name is Joe Shelley, and I work here at Hamilton College, and we're thrilled to be hosting the LACOL meeting here in 2021. Of course, I'm really confident that 2021 is going to look a whole lot brighter than 2020. So thank you all for starting it off right with us today. I am privileged to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker today. But first, I really want to thank Liz Evans, Director of LACOL, and the Hamilton College Steering Committee that brought this conference to us today. So thank you so much to all of you for their really incredible work and all the logistics behind organizing the workshop. And by the way, at the end of the session, there will be a Q&A session moderated by my colleague, Maria Ana Ohms, our Associate Dean for Students for Diversity and Inclusion at Hamilton College. So thank you, Maria, and everyone look forward to that towards the end of the keynote. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Bryan Alexander. Bryan is an award-winning, internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher working in the field of higher education's future. Bryan completed his English language and literature PhD at the University of Michigan in 1997 with a dissertation on doppelgangers in romantic era fiction and poetry. Bryan has taught literature, writing, multimedia, and information technology studies at Centenary College of Louisiana, where he also pioneered a multi-campus interdisciplinary classes while organizing an information literacy initiative. From 2002 to 2014, Bryan worked with the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, a nonprofit working to help small colleges and universities best integrate digital technologies. Bryan speaks widely and publishes frequently, with articles appearing in venues including the Atlantic Monthly and Inside Higher Ed. He has been interviewed and featured with the Washington Post, MSNBC, the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, National Public Radio, the Chronicle on Higher Education, the Atlantic Monthly, Reuters, Times Higher Education, the National Association of College and University Business Officers, that's NACUBO for those of you following along at home, Pew Research, Campus Technology, The Hustle, Minnesota Public Radio, the Connected Learning Alliance, and I could go on. Bryan recently published Academia Next, The Futures of Higher Education for Johns Hopkins University Press, which won the Association of Professional Futurists Award. He is currently working on Universities on Fire, Higher Education in the Age of Climate Crisis. His two other recent books include Gearing Up for Learning Beyond K-12 and The New Digital Storytelling, which is in second edition. On top of all this, I don't know where you get it. I don't know where you find the time, Bryan, but Bryan also hosts the Future Trends Forum, which each week the Future Trends Forum offers a thought-provoking, interactive online discussion with forward-looking thinkers and leaders from across the higher education landscape. Bryan is a senior scholar at Georgetown University, teaches graduate seminars in their Learning, Design, and Technology program. So that's just a little bit about Bryan. I know that you will tell us some more. But please join me in welcoming Bryan Alexander, who will be speaking to us today on gaming and liberal education. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Joe, for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you to the LACOL staff, especially to Liz and Nora for setting this up. Thanks to Hamilton. I haven't visited there for too long, and thank you for helping host all of this. And greetings to everyone at LACOL, some old friends and some new. It's good to see all of you. Like Joe said, I'm Bryan Alexander. I'll be your presenter and haranguer for the next 45 minutes. But it's actually going to be a little shorter than that because we'll have Q&A, which Maria Ana Ohms will be ably monitoring and facilitating. So what we're going to be looking at is a particular aspect of digital technology. We're going to be looking at gaming in higher education and what that means for liberal education. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to throw a bunch of slides at you. But before those slides start occupying your brain, what I'd like to ask is just really quickly in the chat, if you could just toss in really quickly a note about what games you're playing and have played this past year. And if no games are an answer, that also counts. And if a game includes something wonderfully low-tech like cribbage or cards, please put that in. And if you want to be sarcastic and say I'm playing the game of managing a college's finances during a pandemic, that also counts. It's definitely one of the world's most difficult and challenging games. Marcelo offers the saddest possible answer, which is to say solitaire. Brett, the awesome Brett Olson, who is playing the awesome game Subnautica, which is great. Reed is playing Pandemic. I don't know how to take that. There is actually such a game of that. We've got Sudoku, Scrabble, Mexican train dominoes. I'm not even sure what that is, Janet, but I'm excited. And Jaya is playing the New York Times Spelling Bee. I see. And we have some hardcore gamers too. I'm seeing someone's playing Pandemic Season 2, which means they are definitely a hardcore gamer. Jonathan, family jigsaws count. Definitely do. Kara, good for you with cribbage. We see bridge, we see bingo. Oh, what a great range of folks. All right. Thank you, everybody. And for those who said no, I'm glad that you're here because, first of all, you're brave to say no in a geeky session, but also because we can tell you things and we can welcome you. And Elizabeth wins the nerd crowd by saying she's playing D&D, although KT Vaughn is trying to outdo her by saying Pathfinder. Very good. Well, welcome, everybody. Well, what I'm going to do for the next bit is answer this question. Is why on earth are we talking about gaming and education in 2021? Don't we have a lot of other issues to be thinking about and worried about? Well, here's what we'll do in order to answer that question. First, I'm just going to quickly sketch out what's going on with gaming right now, what the state of affairs is. And then we'll explore the potential for gaming in education. And then we're going to look at why that potential hasn't been fully realized or what went wrong. Then we're going to focus on the liberal arts angle. And there, as we go, I would love to hear from all of you. And in fact, I'd love to hear from all of you throughout. And at the very end, as befits a futurist, I'm going to look ahead as to where all of this might be headed. Again, as we go, please feel free to throw questions and comments into the chat. If there's any point you want us to really circle back to, please let us know. To begin with, I'm going to start off by talking about computer gaming, and the field of computer gaming right now is absolutely immense. It is vast, it is diverse, it is enormously creative. There's an awful lot of stuff going on, and we just break that down. Depending on the data, and there are a lot of different measurements, about 3 billion, maybe a few more people play computer games right now. That's roughly 40% of the entire human race. And that's especially impressive when you think that not everybody has access to good hardware and networking. As an industry, economically, it's worth about $200 billion, which means it is bigger than movies and TV combined. If you look at the United States, roughly something like 60 to 70% of people are gamers. I'm seeing estimates, as you can see here, from 214 to 244 million people playing games. And in fact, some games are absolutely enormous in their player base. Some of these represent some of the largest cultural experiences that we share. So for example, Overwatch, which yields something like 8% of the American population playing at a given time. And it's an extraordinary cultural moment as well as quite a technological achievement behind that. Now, computer gaming has developed in some detail and some depth since its invention in the 1960s. Right now, I could point you to, for example, a wide range of game genres, from interactive fiction to first-person shooter to open world, real-time strategy games, sports games, puzzles, role-playing games. In fact, right now, there's a fascinating development of what you could call art games or critical games. On the bottom right of the screen, for example, is a recent product from a satirical games outfit called Moley Industries. That's a game where you play a drone operator. On the bottom left is a shot from a game where the main purpose of it is to wander and explore and walk. In fact, there's actually a subgenre called walking simulator. At the top right is one grab from Fold It, which is a science game that helps you teach proteins how to fold. And from the left is a game which uses time and the manipulation of time as its main mechanism. My point here is that games are actually pretty complex, and we can compare them to a couple of other fields. They're about as complicated and diverse as, say, movies and TV. That is, There's no one kind of game that dominates, just like there's no one kind of movie that dominates or one kind of TV show. You have soap operas, you have mysteries, you have Twin Peaks, you have Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Just like in music, where there is music of all kinds and all genres. And that's more or less where computer gaming is right now. Now, why does this matter for education? Well, to begin with, there are 5 major uses of gaming in education. And I say these are established because these have all been demonstrated at length for years, if not decades. We can break them out like this. I'm going to dive into them. The first is games as learning content, as stuff you can learn from. A second is having students make games or have other people make games. A third is gamification, which is the transfer of game principles into higher education or other domains. And the fourth is game studies as a scholarly research enterprise. And the last is gaming as part of co-curricular life or student life in general. So let's just dive into these. There are a lot of examples of games for learning. You can find a lot of these, by the way, outside of higher ed in K through 12 spaces, as well as in the military and marketing and training. So these games, for example, the top right and the bottom left are history games and politics games. The top left and bottom right are science games showing you operations in the quantum realm, for example. There are many, many business games which teach microeconomics as well as a few simulation games that teach macroeconomics. This, for example, is a very, very detailed training guide to help you run a fabric manufacturing. It's very challenging and takes quite a bit of time. It's non-trivial to play. This is one of many, many simulation games that simulate disease and the spread of disease. This was actually produced by the Centers for Disease Control. It's a challenging game. I recommend it. There are, in fact, more than a few like this. In the chat, a few people mentioned the board game Pandemic. There's also a mobile game with more or less the same name. And in fact, I drew on some of the findings of such games and such research in my most recent book. Where I have the now notorious page 23, where I asked the reader to imagine what would happen if a pandemic struck the world. I wrote this in 2017, 2018. The book came out over the winter of 2019, 2020. This isn't anything unusually prescient. Like I said, we have a lot of games and simulations modeling this. I just wish we'd paid a bit more attention to them. There are games that cover a wide range of curricular and learning purposes. This is a very famous one, for example, called Depression Quest, which models the mental experience of depression. This has gotten rave reviews from everywhere, from mental health experts to novelists. Now, there are a lot of reasons for treating games as pedagogical and learning materials. And one of them is that they are a powerful example of digital media. Like other digital media, such as audio or video, they have replayability. I mean, you can rewind and replay. You can also use them to make stuff. You can generate media. You can simply do screen captures or video recordings of your play, or you can do more advanced work like modifying a game. And that's the last part too, is that you can remix and modify games. You can make them more complicated, more simple, add characters, subtract characters, change them into something sarcastic. So again, like other digital media that we use in education, we have these features. But within gaming, there are a whole set of ideas. James Paul G is one of the great scholars in this field, and I strongly recommend his work. But these are just a few of the ideas that he points out. For example, he reminds us that all computer games teach. Now, you might not like what they teach, or what they teach might not be interesting, but think of it this way. They have to teach you how to play the game. They don't usually come with rule books, and if they do, almost nobody reads them. So they have tutorials of different types. And even if they're teaching you something as simple as flinging birds across a skyline, or something as complicated as running all of Europe during the First World War, they have to teach you. And the gaming business is incredibly competitive. So they have to succeed in those tutorials. There's also what G calls the regime of competence. That is, if you go back to some learning theory, you think that when you play a game, the game has to match your ability so that the game is not too easy, so that it becomes boring, and so it's not too challenging, so that you can't play it. It has to be just one step ahead of the player to keep things interesting, which is in many ways how learning works best. There are a few other points here. I'll just mention the probing, exploration, discovery mechanism, which is pretty exciting. The projective identity aspect, which is role-playing. That is, you can play being in charge of Europe during the First World War. There's also a psychosocial moratorium, which is a fancy way of saying it's okay to die, fail, and generally cause a disaster. And we accept that within games, and you can keep going. And there's also, crucially for pedagogy, rapid assessment and feedback, indeed often instantaneous. Now, another way of using games in education is to make games or to use games to make stuff. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with Minecraft, which is an extraordinary story. It's a combination of game and platform, a kind of parallel universe where Legos are supreme. But people have been making all kinds of stuff in Minecraft. And during the pandemic, people replicated everything from classrooms to DNA molecules to their own graduation. We've seen a lot of instances of this, and I'm going to circle back to this one, but this is a Gettysburg College professor who had his students make games about their curriculum. I'll come back to that to explain how that works. A little bit of cavelling, a little bit of bragging on my side. I've taught games for years, and at Georgetown, some of my students have really gotten into this, including during my gaming seminar. So one of them, a science teacher, built a fascinating short game where you are in charge of some East Asian country and its science enterprise. And you have to make a series of decisions about how to deal with everything from climate change to extreme weather to budgeting. And it's not an easy game. And it teaches you quite a bit about how to organize science. And that student is very impressive because not only did she make this game, and I thought it was pretty successful, but then she rewrote the entire game from scratch in Filipino because she wanted to get back in touch with that language. So you can play that game in that language as well. In fact, there are actually a small group of games about education. This is a game, for example, about trying to get into school called Mission Admission. There is a game from the Heckinger Report, which is also about getting into college, which has more of a social aspect to it. Now, a third way of thinking about this is to think in terms of gamification, and that's when you try to take game principles out of games and apply them to the real world. And people have been doing this in schools for quite some time, although at a small scale. That can mean adding levels, points, roles, and badges and other game mechanisms. Could be framing part or the entire class as a collaborative quest or mystery. It can mean allowing multilinear, multiple paths through class content, and can mean using small, short game-based exercises using technology such as Kahoot. Now, another field of this, and this really comes in handy when you think about students as researchers, is game studies as a field of academic study. And this dates back to the early 20th century. In fact, here are two of the classic books in the genre, but there are many, many other examples of this. MIT Press has an enormous stream of scholarly books on games. There are game journals of all kinds. So on the right is a quick list of some current in-print journals. On the left is one of the leading game studies journals, and they were just celebrating their 20th anniversary. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about this. If you'd like, I could come back and circle back to explain some of the topics in that field. Now, speaking of studying this, there's also a question of how do you archive and preserve games, which is actually a deep and very challenging issue. A lot of librarians have been doing some research into this. Here's a screenshot from my alma mater, the University of Michigan, where they have a spectacular game archive. But I point this out also because games can have a non-classroom role on campus. They can appear in student life, they can be used in residence halls, they can be used in student unions. And in fact, we now have the burgeoning field of esports, which is really taking off like wildfire in certain colleges and universities. In fact, we hosted on the Future Trends Forum, the leader of Liberal Arts College, Austin College, his esports league we got to learn a great deal about. If you'd like to learn more about that, there's a link there in the bottom. And there are non-pedagogical reasons to use gaming. And one of them is that to play, but especially to make or manipulate games, you need to demonstrate and, of course, learn technical skills, everything from audio to video to coding. You also have to consider game studies or practicing games as a way of getting into the production of games as a career, because the game industry is very large. And there's also the argument that gaming can teach soft skills when you have multiplayer games. Just quick check for those of you in the chat. How are we doing so far? Are we going too fast, too slow, just right? Are we in the Goldilocks zone, or do we need more bears? Okay, all right, thank you all. So if it's all this awesome, if gaming is this terrific and fabulous, how come we're not doing everything in games? Why doesn't gaming dominate the world? Well, there are a few reasons, and I need to go back in time for the first. We had a great kind of renaissance of games in education from 2003 to 2008. The first book that really kicked this off is James Paul Gee's What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, a terrific, really well-organized book, short too. I teach it a lot, I recommend it. And that helped kick off a lot of research and development, a lot of practice, a lot of ideas. And one of the culminations of this was a massive MacArthur grant to an economist to build a massively multiplayer online simulation of Shakespearean theater in 2008. At the same time, in 2008, we had a major kickoff of the idea of nudging. That is, basically, they don't use the term, but to use gamification to encourage people to change their behavior. And this is phrased in terms of public policy and public good. For example, how to get people to vote more often, or how to get people to do certain things in public health. So by about 2008, this was really, really building up. And then things went south. The great financial disaster of 2008 really clobbered a lot of higher education finance. So among other things that let us cut off gaming projects because they just weren't as critical. We also saw a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism. 2011, the excellent scholar, writer, and game designer, Ian Bogost, published several devastating critiques of gamification. I recommend them. His hilariously titled Gamification is Bullshit, although he's actually referring to it in the philosophical sense, and his gamification is exploitationware. 2014, the Gamergate catastrophe unfolded, which helped kind of ruin the reputation of gaming for a lot of people, as well as causing some harm. And in 2015, the famous Horizon report, which had been boosting gaming, stopped mentioning it. So it looked like things had gone downhill. And there were other reasons too in academia. A lot of people were afraid of the cost, either financial or in time, in order to build up a game. There was the concern that there wasn't enough appropriate content for a curriculum. So some games are just interesting in the abstract way, but can't fit into, say, intermediate French or certain problems in biology. And then there was a reputational problem. There's a lot of perceptions that gaming was biased towards men and boys and away from girls and women. There were persistent concerns about violence, that is, the representation of violence, or people thinking that games caused violence. And then also in higher education, the sense that games are just not what we do, that they are for children. Maybe there's something awful about them, and maybe that they're not really intellectual objects, not worth study, much less introduction into the classroom. In fact, people haven't really made this case thoroughly, but I think we saw gaming and education go through a kind of Gartner hype cycle moment. That is from 2003, 2008, we saw a lot of interest, which peaked and then it just burst. The hype bubble kind of popped. And right now, we've climbed out of the trough of disillusionment and what Gartner calls the slope of enlightenment, followed by the plateau of productivity. We're just using games for what they can do. So right now in 2011, we're seeing a few things. We're seeing continuous R&D happening, both the development of games, the development of pedagogy and practice. We're also seeing nudge theory. It's been involved in policy. It was used by the Obama administration, for example. We're also seeing, especially after the pandemic, really close attention to improving the student experience, especially more or less in the entire world of higher education. We're seeing new technologies being applied for gaming. I just saw a great session, for example, here on VR. That's one area where gaming is rapidly expanding. And there's just continuous research on how to use games for teaching and learning. We're also seeing an interesting branching out. I've been talking about digital games, but the tabletop and role-playing worlds have expanded enormously. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and every week there are simulations conducted by the military, by the foreign policy establishment, by FEMA, trying to use tabletop games to better understand all kinds of real-world problems. And the digital world and the tabletop world have become closer and closer and more integrated. So this is great, you could say, but Bryan, we're here for liberal education. We're here for the small number of colleges and universities that are liberal arts colleges. Why are you talking about this stuff? What does it mean for us? Well, first of all the reasons I've talked about so far apply to liberal education, everything from games as learning materials to doing research. But there are a few others that are distinct or especially seen in liberal arts colleges. There's the idea of creativity, that we really celebrate our students' our students' creativity, and we really want them to follow that up. We want to see more of it. We also believe in undergraduate research, really kind of beyond any other sector in higher ed. So students studying games or making game content can fit in here. We're also famous for our interdisciplinary approaches to learning, and games really don't fit into any particular discipline. They are definitely cross-disciplinary technologies and objects. And we also really believe in student-centered learning. So this is one way. Benjamin Ho, hello, Ben. I haven't seen you for a few years. I hope you're doing well. Ben notes that behavioral economics has argued that nudges are not as well, that their effects are quite small and can backfire. That's just the start of criticisms of nudge policies. In fact, Ben, there's a lot of people who find them to be manipulative or crass or totalitarian. I'm not pointing out the connection between gaming and nudges to celebrate it, but to point out that they exist. Well, we've already seen people using gaming in liberal education quite extensively in many ways. For example, Professor DePaul, Harry Brown, was one of the first to publish a really great scholarly book on video games and education, which I really recommend. It's a little dated in that the games that he refers to are older, because of course the book is 13 years old. But the ideas are still there, and they're ideas that people have been following up really closely. Incidentally, DePaul actually picked a computer game for the student summer reading once. They picked the game Portal 2, which is actually a very, very fine choice. Now, in terms of people making games, well, I mentioned this game before, so just to explain what you're looking at here, this is an example of interactive fiction. Interactive fiction is a game genre that goes back to the 1970s, and it's one that's largely text-based. The player enters commands into a line, and the world responds and changes in results. So, for example, here you've appeared on a hill. You can see some people nearby, and there's some kind of ritual being performed, and you should type in what you do next. And it could be look at people. You could type in go to the hill. It could be consult map, and so on. And the game responds as you go. There are a lot of tools for making this, but the key reason that Professor Fee used this at Gettysburg College was in a class on medieval literature and medieval culture. He wanted his students to really understand deeply medieval sites, that is, monasteries or fortifications, cathedrals, ruins of all kinds. So he had his students create games about each individual site. And he would then, other people could then play through the games in order to learn about those sites. It's a fascinating idea. Now, I mentioned games as learning objects or as learning materials, and there are a lot of examples of this. This is one from Dickinson College, where Professor Ed Webb, whom some of you might know, taught classes in the history of empires. And so initially, he had his students play games like Civilization, where you get to build an empire. And he had students play this game and then use that in order to understand the mechanisms of empire. The instructional technology staff there then collaborated with him to modify the games, to add new content, to add new regimes, to add new options, which are quite fascinating. This screenshot right here is actually from the Steam page on this, where you can find a lot more and quite a few more examples. Just down the campus from him, his colleague in political science used another game called Peacemaker to simulate conflicts between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli state. He built that into a political science class. There are many examples like this. Now, I can confess personally to have done an early example of this. In 1999, I co-taught a class across 3 liberal arts colleges, Centenary College in Louisiana, University of Richmond in Virginia, and Rollins College in Florida. We taught a class on the American experience of Vietnam. And one of things that we did was we built a political science decision-making game about the Johnson administration's decision to escalate the war in 1964 and 65. We broke our students into groups, each representing a major decision maker. We gave them lots of content, and we gave them 5 turns to play through where they had to make crucial decisions. It was a fascinating game, very rewarding. The students were just blown away by it and wanted to run it again. We've played this a couple of times. Now, if you want to go even further, there's a liberal arts success story in the gaming field that really doesn't get nearly enough love. Have any of you played or looked at any of the reacting to the past games? If you have, just put that in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. For those of you who haven't, reacting to the past games are basically historical role-playing games. Oh, glad to see you, Russell, Bravo, and Beth. Yes. They take place, they simulate a key decision moment, often a historical trial. For example, Brett Mulligan mentions Athens, so we have the trial of Socrates. You wrote a Catalan game, Brett. I'd love to see that. So, for example, you have the screenshot here is from the 1945 conference at Simla, where major leaders of then colonial India met with the then imperial Britain in order to figure out what they were going to do next, how they were going to organize India. Players, students simulate individual characters and decision makers. They're given a great deal of primary source material, secondary source material, and they have to hash through their decision-making process. I've run 2 of these, one on a medieval British town coping with the Black Death, and another on early 19th century Britain dealing with industrialization. I can testify that they are rich, fascinating, very powerful for students, and there's a whole ton of these. And again, this all comes from Barnard College. So this is a great, great liberal arts achievement, which I definitely just want to celebrate. All right, so all of this that we're talking about has already happened. This is all stuff we know about, this stuff that's in print, that's been done. Looking ahead a bit, where is all this going? Suzanne, thank you so much. Glad to hear that. Well, we keep developing games and learning. So we're doing a great deal of research, but also practice. We're producing more guides, we're producing more ways in. This is just a nice little flow chart to take you through how to build a game or how to select a game. There's continued interest in the subject and basically incremental growth. So no big waves, no tidal wave of games, but just continued iteration. We're seeing more and more projects bubbling up all over the place. We're seeing the use of new hardware, specifically for extended reality, virtual reality. And the software needed to make games continues to grow. We get new platforms and improved old ones. For example, to make interactive fiction, I've been using Twine for quite some time, which is a nice, accessible, powerful tool. Storyboard is even easier, it just came out. Game Maker, the best name for a game making application, is now in a recent edition, which makes it even more accessible. You can find lots and lots of tutorials on how to use that, especially from LinkedIn. Unity has been moving from strength to strength. It's a widely used platform. Just an hour ago, Ben Salzman pointed out that Unity is getting easier and easier to use. It's still a big thing, but it's getting more accessible. And there are platforms like Itch, which is where people just share all kinds of games that they produce. Carly Bourne from Carleton mentions that there are plugins for the LMS that enable games and gamification within courses, which is great to see. Now, looking a bit further ahead, I can see a few more trends that are taking place in this space. One is increasing attention to social justice and critical studies of games and gaming. Now, this has been going on for quite some time, especially in Europe, but it's really taking off in the US. And in fact, last summer, when I taught my gaming seminar at Georgetown, the students really wanted to make that a special course of study. So we did a lot of research into that. There are a bunch of games I could point you to on that score. For example, this is a game about being poor and trying to figure out how to survive and save money. It's just called Spent. It's a very effective, very powerful game. And we're also continuing to make games. So for example, this is a grad student, Caitlin Kirby, made 2 different games about teaching during the pandemic. One about being a student, this is what you have the screenshot here, and one about being a professor. And these games made an argument that teaching in the pandemic face-to-face would be very, very challenging. We're also seeing some interesting connections to information literacy. So to back up, there's been a lot of concern about information online starting in 2016 because of the election of Trump, and since then, of course, the Trump administration. Now, information literacy actually goes way back to the 1980s. In its media literacy form, it goes back to the 1960s. But we still have this concern of how do you detect what's good and what's not, what's good information, what's useful information, what's flawed. It's a whole elaborate field with a lot of great work on it, especially in the library world. Well, games actually connect to present day politics and current events. For example, this is one of many I could point you to, a game where you play an Uber driver. Now, the intent of the game is first to simulate the experience, but also second, to criticize it. And so playing this game can teach you a lesson. It can also help shape your attitude, which gives us the interesting challenge of how do we teach students to apprehend this in a critical way. There's already at least one scholarly book on the topic, which I definitely recommend. Again, co-authored by Ian Bogost, who I praised before. Now, we mentioned nudge theory, and Benjamin Ho mentioned very apt criticism of it. And I want to just repeat back to it because the Biden administration is picking up a lot of policies and a lot of people from the Obama administration, and we may see a return to that in the form of gamification of different policies. There hasn't been enough of this, I think, in the field of public health, which seems to be in many ways a shambles, but we may expect to see more of this to come. Just to return to an earlier theme, think about gaming again in terms of movies or music. We've been using movies and music in classes for a long, long, long time. In music, going back to the academy in ancient Greece. They don't apply to every situation. We often are more likely to consume them than to make them. But we do see uses of all kinds. And I think gaming slots in alongside movies and music. One last point. Your VP at Hamilton was very kind to mention my current book project, which is called Universities on Fire. And it's about higher education in the age of climate change. And one chapter concerns pedagogy and how we teach climate change. Well, one piece of that has to do with games and simulations, because games and simulations of climate change do a lot of good things. One is they teach systems thinking. This is, for example, one game which puts you in charge of the world's nations and some regions and asks you to imagine and plug in their emissions peaks, how they're adjusting forestation, and immediately gives you back how that changes the Earth's temperature, as well as the overall degrees of net greenhouse gas emissions. There are other games, including board games, that teach this in part to help make a very complicated and scary subject more accessible. I think you'll see more and more of these. Now, this is something that I've been researching and working on since the 1990s. So if you'd like to hear more about this or you want to see more about this, at futureofeducation.us, you can find some of my projects there. I'd be happy to say more. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do now is pause all of these slides and stop throwing them at you and turn over to all of you so I can hear more from your questions and your thoughts. Maria, did you have a prompt you wanted to lead off with?
Yes, I did. And I wanted to thank you, Bryan, so much for this keynote. And to everyone that's joining us, what I'd like to do is, yes, clap, 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 clap. I see some claps coming up. What I would like to invite you all to do is feel free to load any questions into the chat function of Zoom. Otherwise, if you would like to open up your mic, please raise your hand and I will call on you so you can ask your question. But in the meantime, I'm going to start us off with a question that I have for you, Bryan. This idea of games and gamification, the way that you're sharing it, is something that I'm really excited about, and I'm going to look into it. And I've touched on gamification in my work in student life and supporting students. And I think maybe my role can give you a little bit of insight into what I'm really part of my interest. And you mentioned the social justice component of how we can utilize games and gamification in higher education. And I'm curious to know, because I'm interested in how we can have students engage more meaningfully with one another around their differences and celebrating their differences. Have you had any insight in how we can use games for that, in a way that builds more connection when students are on our campus, for them to get to know one another, challenge one another in healthy ways?
Sure. Well, straight up, one of the ways this works is by considering games to be social objects. One of the misperceptions of gaming is that it's often kind of a human versus machine thing. But in fact, social gaming is actually an enormous, enormous function of games. People play everything from sitting around the same room, each taking a different controller, to being physically distributed around the world playing a game. And now that can be toxic and horrible in some ways. Like with sports, there can be a lot of trash talking and verbal abuse, but can also be a way for people to work together. I mentioned, for example, the idea of games teaching teaching soft skills. And that's one way that games can really work. So people playing together in the same campus, it's a way to shake up their understanding of each other. You think about them if they are represented by other avatars. So that's an interesting way to kind of defamiliarize each other. A second way to think about this, though, is game content that bears on this. One of the slides I showed, for example, was a rerun of a classic game. So just to dive back into the past for a minute, back in the 1970s was a famous game aimed at elementary school kids called Oregon Trail. And some of you may know it. It's a game that lets you just kind of stalk through the American West on the way to settlement. And it's very famous for its famous death, which is "You have died of dysentery." And you will see people with T-shirts that say "You have died of dysentery." So if you're wondering, I've just explained a great mystery to you. But it was very much written from a settler point of view. So we had a group of Native American scholars and Native American game designers actually write a completely different version of the game from the Native American point of view. So thinking about that, for example, playing that game as a way of thinking about indigenous peoples and their heritage is one really powerful way forward. There are games about the experience of being Black in the United States, including being a slave, including the civil rights movement. There are games about the Latino experience and so on. So you'll see more and more of that. And that's a second way of playing. I think a third point, and then I want to hear from other people as well, Maria, is I think the playfulness and the relaxation of games, when you're not trying to kill each other, is something that is really good, especially for students who may come to an elite liberal arts college being very, very prepared, very hardworking, being stressed to death.
Right.
And I think being able to chill out and goof off with games is a really, really good way for them to do that with each other. I think that can really help.
Yes, I agree. I think that the benefits to their mental health of being able to do something other than, right, than shift a little bit and be a little bit hyper focus and be more focused on just enjoying themselves with one another. Sure.
Yeah, well said. Better said than I did.
Does anyone else have any input on that or anything to share?
I just want to draw attention to one thing in the chat. Benjamin Ho put a link to a game, so you guys can check that out, and he can say more about that.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to save this. Benjamin, would you like to share a little bit more about that link that you shared?
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is just the summer of games for me. I have a couple summer projects. One is working with a student to teach people recycling at Vassar. One problem here we learned at Vassar is I think almost half the recycling is contaminated and can't be used. And so we're trying to bring those numbers down, and we're doing that by sort of creating a game, ideally for phone use, to be used during freshman orientation. And so that's the link there. My other summer project is actually to use game theory to understand Among Us. So someone also mentioned Among Us in the chat. So that's my summer research agenda.
So you mean to use the intellectual apparatus of game theory to understand the computer game Among Us?
Exactly, the mathematical game theory that economists use to study things like stock markets. We're going to use to study Among Us and how people play Among Us.
Very good. If I can pick on Ben one last time, he mentioned mobile devices. One of the things about gaming is that it appears in just every hardware platform. So obviously you have game consoles, but also you have mobile devices of all kinds, tablets and handhelds. and you have, of course, PCs. If you look at mobile devices, if you look at their game stores, if you look at their app stores, games are absolutely enormous. They're very, very high up. Lots and lots of games there. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yes, thank you, Ben. All right, so while we're waiting for more questions to come in, a lot of, I see Russell has his hand up. Go ahead, Russell, do you want to open up your mic?
Sure, why not? I guess an information question about, I know a lot of the games that my students play are really violent. They are, right? First person shooter kinds of games. And I guess I don't know enough. I know a lot about tabletop games. I don't know anything about video games. So I wonder if you could talk about just proportions of games when students are playing video games. How violent are they, and how much of that is just a lot of shooting and killing?
Russell, first of all, thank you for being brave enough to confess to knowing a lot about tabletop games and an academic audience. That's I usually am like the lead nerd in a session, but I'm glad that you're with me on this. So thank you. Are you the one who mentioned playing Pandemic Season 2? No? Okay.
I wasn't. We just started playing Season 0 2 days ago, so we're excited about
Don't
that.
say anything. I need to get to it. Okay.
Yeah, we just played the prologue.
And Joe's with us. Okay, so to explain, I would again come back to movies, and I would come back to music as analogies, because both of them contain a great deal of violence. That is, we have a long centuries-old tradition of songs that are about or celebrate violence. I mean, everything from Scottish murder ballads to gangster rap. The same is true of movies. If you were to stroll down a movie theater lobby, which we can do now for the first time in a long time, you'll see quite a few posters that celebrate extreme violence. My own doctorate was in Gothic literature, so I know horror films very well. So I'm very familiar with cinematic violence and how extensive it can be. Gaming, I think, is comparable. There are a lot of games that involve violence to different degrees of realism, much like in movies. You have some that are meticulous, terrifying, and gory, and some that are cartoonish. So you think about Fortnite, for example, which is technically a bloodbath, but no one experiences it as such. And then you have games that have nothing to do with that. Games that are about all kinds of other issues. So right now, there's a lot of literature trying to research games to prove that games cause violence, and there is no causal link that has ever been established, except for weird blips and goofy research findings, like someone playing a violent computer game for an hour, 5 minutes afterwards, their pulse is elevated. Shock, surprise, right? But in terms of popular culture, there was a great deal of concern about violence in computer games. Again, much like we have popular culture concerns about violence in movies. It used to be in books, but we don't worry about that as much anymore. I wouldn't worry about it as much for your students, except this may be something for them to pursue and for you to pursue as a scholarly inquiry.
I guess my question was following up really on Maria's question about using games to bring people together and to establish communities. And I wonder if we'd really want to do that around games that are so based in violence. Whatever the causal link, I agree, cartoonish. Like I'm not concerned so much about that, but I'm wondering about as institutions endorsing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it may be then that you want to, if you do this programmatically, then you want to pick something which is not explicitly violent. I was just about to enter in the chat box to you and Joe that I'm a big fan of the tabletop game Terraforming Mars, which is a game about changing the chemistry and surface of Mars, which is violent in the sense that you're whacking the surface of Mars with big rocks. But other than that, there's no interpersonal violence. Similarly, there are all kinds of games, some which I've showed today, which you might want to prefer instead. That's a good question for you and Maria.
Yeah. Thank you, Russell, for that follow-up. I see Carly. Carly, you have your hand up. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up kind of on the topic that Russell brought up about violence in games. And of course, as Bryan mentioned, the type of game is crucial, picking what kind of game it is you're going to try to implement. I facilitated using Minecraft for education with 6th and 7th graders this past year during the pandemic.
Nice.
And they had to establish a society, and they had to elect a mayor, and they had to decide on roles, and they had to decide on penalties for somebody who didn't follow the rules. And they had to do all of those things. And it was chaotic in terms of getting the tech to work because everybody was disparate, right? But it was an amazing experience, I think, for the students in sort of establishing authority and community building, especially for the sixth graders who started this year transitioning to a middle school environment without actually being in a middle school environment. I'm mom to one of those sixth graders, so I know very, very well how hard that was for them, and finding a way to create that community using puzzle games or even just gamification elements in your LMS or things like that is just, it's so rewarding, I think. So it's more of a comment, not so much a question, but yeah.
What a great story, Carly. Have you written this up anywhere? I'd love to learn more.
I haven't because the school year just ended and I'm exhausted.
No pressure, but that's a great story. Thank you very much for saying that. I mean, that's part of the, again, that's what I mentioned, that games are like other digital media in certain areas.
Yeah.
So this is akin to discussion boards or social media, where you have to learn how to socialize.
Yes. And looking in the chat, I see there's a lot of comments. Let's see if you can see them there, Bryan. Let's see.
Yep. Well, there's a really great comment. Again, I want to make sure we don't lose this from another Maria.
Yes.
I hope I didn't mangle that too badly. And hello to Bryn Mawr, please. So the angle in which you can have students create their own games instead of playing ready-made games. Absolutely. This is something that I've mentioned a few times and celebrate. I'm awfully proud of my students' work on the Philippines, but you can see this in many ways. So you can have students make a game that is interactive fiction. That's the simplest and easy to get started with. I mentioned software like Storyboard or Twine, and I have students get to work on that within a half hour of a workshop. And that's a very, very basic way to get going. Another way is to have them use a more challenging multimedia tool, again, like Unity or Game Maker. Another is to have them modify or build on a pre-existing game. So Carly was just talking about making stuff within Minecraft, for example, and there's a lot you can do within that. But also to pick a game. One of my favorite examples is a history game called Rome Total War, which simulates the late Roman Republic. It's a rich, fascinating game, and you play a faction of family as you navigate your way through politics and geography and war. But some people thought the game wasn't realistic enough. So they did things like they went through all of the different characters, adjusted them in terms of their chronology. They took every faction you could play, like the Kingdom of Pontus, found out what their geographical knowledge was in 100 BCE, and then adjusted the map so they wouldn't know certain things and had to explore it. And then that wasn't enough, so they actually found period music played on period instruments to use as the soundtrack. I mean, this is obviously the act of people who never get out. But thinking about modifications, there's a lot you can do with that. And different games have different openings to that. So I celebrate that. Also, you can do this with tabletop games. I had one of my students was fascinated. She lives in Chicago and wanted to get people knowing the different neighborhoods and different groups and subgroups within Chicago. So she built this huge tabletop game with multiple cards. I mean, it's an elaborate game, which teaches you the different neighborhoods of Chicago. So I just want to second that, Maria. Having students make stuff seems very liberal arts to me.
Yes. Well, and what is the game about Chicago, the tabletop game? Do you know the name? Do you remember the name
She
of that game? She
hasn't published it yet.
Oh, she hasn't. Okay.
I've been leaning on her to do this, and it's like, we need this. One more example of that is one of my students last summer create a game on how not to call the police. So this is a digital game where you're put in different social situations where one possible outcome is for you to call the police. And again, this was last summer, the summer of George Floyd. And so again, she was passionate about this, and the game is actually really tricky, giving you all kinds of responses to different social situations and how not to respond. I mean, the goal is to teach you not to call the police. It's a very interesting game.
Yes, yes. And Maria gives you, let's see, gives props on that. Yeah. How not to call the police. And Beth talks about, Beth, who knew? Beth created a game as a teenager.
Beth, this tells us so much about you. So much about you. That's right.
I've been a nerd for many, many decades. That's what it tells you, right?
You're among friends. We love you. Ben, and I'm going to try not to keep picking on Ben. He's just too good and too interesting. Points out that he's worried about the darker sides of gamer culture, and I agree. Again, for me, I do build a link to sports fandom culture, which can be very dangerous. But also Gamergate was unfortunately historically very significant. That was a kind of dry run, I think, for some of the right-wing online brigading we saw starting in 2016. Again, if you look at the sheer numbers of people playing computer games, we're talking about 40% of the human race. It's going to involve some people doing horrible stuff. So I think that's a good point. KT Vaughn mentions modifying two different card games. One's called Apples to Apples and one's called Cards Against Humanity. And they modify them to do library orientation, which is great. If you don't know the games, Apples to Apples is a kind of kids logic puzzle game, which teaches you some interesting fun stuff and comparisons. Cards Against Humanity is the exact opposite. It's a game designed to shock and offend to the maximum extent. So some people love it for that. Some people find it really offensive, which is, I think, why KT's group decided to go for Apples to Apples instead. Maria seconds the Serious Play Conference, which is really good. We've hosted the Serious Play lead, Sue Bowl, on our on the Future Trends forum. Really good stuff. Carly, if you had students role play Nero, I want to see more of this. I want to see. This sounds terrific.
Well, it was a long time ago. The classicists were struggling to get the students to understand why somebody just didn't take out Nero. Like they didn't understand the environment. And so I brought in an expert, which is one of my colleagues, a D&D player from a long time ago. And we talked about NPCs and all of those things. And so we built a kind of like we had a platform that was sort of for social networking kind of thing amongst alumni. We made an instance for this. We gave all of the students identities. Nobody knew who was who. And then we had some NPC profs come in and try to nudge people in different ways so that the students would learn how to understand the environment that people were living under the rule of Nero, and why it wasn't just so easy to just go take them out. So it was fascinating. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, NPC is non-player characters.
That could be very useful.
It's a lot of fun.
Visualizations. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Carly. So I want to be mindful of time because I know that here at 2:30, we're going to be in the meet and greet portion of your keynote, Bryan. So I am going to wrap up this Q&A just as we get to the 2:30, and there will be continued conversation, right? So this isn't going to end, but my part in mediating this will. So I want to thank you so much, Bryan. I'm going to, I'm taking away so much from hearing your keynote and then from this brief conversation. I'm going to try to download this entire chat because there's a lot that I want to look into and use for myself. So thank you for what everyone shared. I will hand it off to Nora or to Liz maybe to move us into the meet and greet portion. And Bryan, I want to thank you for your keynote today. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was a delight, and I really, really enjoyed all of your questions and comments, and I really am honored by the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you.